Welcome to the 32nd episode of Moving Forward on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm your host, Rob Simons. On this show, we discuss what is going on in the world and what we can do moving forward. And today, I just decided that I was going to talk and I've had some things on my mind lately that have really been eating at me that I just want to talk about, and I don't really have anybody that I can talk to about it. So I just thought I'd talk to myself about it basically, and let you all listen in hopes that you get a little bit more of an idea about me, and a little bit about my life, because I just feel like lately with the show I've been doing so much interviews and interviewing people, but which I love to do, but the hardest part of the show is probably when it's just yourself talking and trying to fill up time for an hour of you just doing the show for yourself, because you're just relying on yourself to make up the content. So with that being said, I don't know how long this is going to last, but I just thought I'd give this a try and see if people get something out of it and enjoy it. And, probably just before I moved to Portland, which was in April, I think I did a show where I talked a little bit more about my professional life. And I just gave more of my background, which is that I did state investigations for the state of Florida for about 8 years. But I didn't really get into what type of investigations I did, I don't think, and I didn't get into some specific investigations. And for some odd reason, lately, this has been really eating at me, and what I witnessed and what I observed, and just what it means in the bigger picture. And, I just thought I'd maybe tell some investigative stories, and maybe somebody could tell me what they mean. And I'm hoping to have someone on the show here soon that I think could do a good job at that. So let me start with some first things here is, I was a state investigator for the Florida Department of Health for probably about 5.5 years. I did investigative work for them for almost 3. And I was really with the Department of Health for like 6 years, and 3 years of it was investigative work, and 3 years of it was in management. And I'm going to talk about my investigative work because I came into the Florida Department of Health at a time when there was a lot of things going on in the state of Florida, a lot of a crisis, as you would say. And I know Donald Trump has recently got into this opioid crisis or heroin crisis, and it's an epidemic. And, there's a lot of racial overtones to that because the epidemic is dealing with white people. And I was involved with this crisis back in 2010, about 2010 through 2012. And one commonality that you'll see with people that are now addicted to heroin is that they started with pain pills. And they legitimately had some issue where they needed pain pills to get through the pain, and then they became addicted. The pain pills became too expensive, so they turned to heroin. So that's kind of a little bit of a backdrop of where I come into this opioid crisis. And I come in where 7 people a day in Florida at the time when I was there. So I started in March of 2010. 7 people a day were dying of oxycodone overdose. And you have to remember what was going on in Florida during the time, March 2010. There was still the recession. The Great Recession was impacting Florida. Florida was one of the most economically devastated areas in the country from the Great Recession. The main driver of the Florida economy was tourism, and with everybody losing their shit in savings, there was not much tourism coming down to Florida. It was actually the first time in a very long time where more people were leaving the state of Florida than coming in to live in the state of Florida. That's where I entered. I entered in when people were actually leaving the state, and now it's completely different. I mean, the population is booming in Florida, and again, this is no. I'm not doing any research with this talk here. It's just me kind of shooting from the hip. So I don't have the numbers on next to me to tell you what the population statistics are, but I know that that's a fact. But yeah, so that's the backdrop, right? And so I was in charge of investigating the doctors that were prescribing all these narcotics to patients, the oxycodone. Which, in case if you didn't understand, well, why do people go from oxycodone to heroin, and why do they make that leap? Well, oxycodone is synthetic heroin. That's why. I mean, the properties are extremely similar as heroin. There's heroin in oxycodone. So, of course, it would make sense to go with the cheaper stuff, which is just buying heroin on the streets. So, let's talk about an investigation I did. And I could talk about this because it's all public record. You could look it up for yourself if you wanted to. Anyone that's listening to this rant. And it was an organization. It was what they call pill mills, right? I'm sure people have read about pill mills, and these are just medical facilities that pop up where doctors prescribe oxycodone, basically like candy. And so there's a cocktail that's being prescribed that is causing people to die from these overdoses, right? And so the cocktail it's oxycodone, it's Xanax, and it's Soma. And when you mix these drugs together and you're taking these drugs together, what happens is that your heart stops. And that's how you're dying from an overdose. These drugs together stop your heart. Oxycodone is a pain reliever. Xanax is dealing with anxiety, and then Soma is the muscle relaxer. So these are kind of what each of the different drugs do. But the cocktail is 2 different doses of oxycodone. So someone will take the typical cocktail that these doctors prescribed was oxycodone 30 milligrams and oxycodone 15 milligrams. So the 30 milligrams obviously is the more potent dose, but what you would do is you would take the 30 milligrams every 4 to 6 hours, and then in between that 4 and 6 hours when you're waiting to take your next tablet of 30 milligrams, if you had some pain, or they called it quote unquote breakthrough pain, you would take an oxycodone 15 milligrams, which would be every 2 to 3 hours, to get through the breakthrough pain that you were experiencing. So, I mean, really, you were just taking oxycodone around the clock. And this all started in Florida probably in 2008. But I don't feel like law enforcement and the state of Florida that regulated the doctors and the pharmacies that were filling the prescriptions started taking this seriously probably till I got there, which was in 2010. And, you have to remember the economics with this. So when I'd go into these doctors' offices, particularly, let's talk about Total Medical Express, which is the one that I investigated. I would see patients come from all over the country to get their hands on these pills. And how do I know they're from all over the country? Well, I'd look in the parking lot and you'd see license plates from all over the country, as far as Washington State. People would drive from Washington State all the way down to Florida to go to these clinics. The majority of customers were probably from Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio. That was overwhelming the majority. There was a lot of people from Massachusetts that would come in. What they would do, though, is they were smart enough to take the train instead of drive, and they would bring the drugs to and from Florida via train as opposed to driving in cars. So let's talk about Total Medical Express. It was a clinic operation that had facilities all over the state of Florida. Um, and I went to do what they call an inspection. So part of my job as an investigator was to inspect facilities that um, they dispense drugs in house. So what does that mean? That means that if I'm a patient, I walk in to Total Medical Express, a doctor writes me prescriptions, and I can get them filled and dispensed right on the spot, as long as that doctor has a certain modification on their license, which all of these pain doctors were smart enough to do that, because how do they make some serious money? It's not only the visits, but it's when they would dispense the drugs at the facility. That's where they make the real money. And you would see price tags in the facility. So say I went to go do an inspection, and I would see right at the desk of the receptionist, I'd see something taped that would show oxycodone is $5 a pill, Xanax is $2 a pill, Soma is $1 a pill. So that's not something you see in your normal pharmacy, just to let you know, because it's almost like you have an in-house pharmacy in the facility. Um, so, um, I went to do this inspection, and it was basically just all these doctors just prescribing to patients all over the country, and just doing these cocktails. And they were writing prescriptions so fast that they weren't even dating them. Some of them, they were smart enough finally, because they were wearing out their hands because they were writing so many, that they would just stamp the prescriptions of what the medicine was and what the dose. So they'd have like an oxycodone 30 milligram, 180 tablet stamp, and they just stamp them and sign them. So, I opened up cases against all these doctors, and I got patient records and started investigating these doctors. Well, so you probably wonder, well, how much oxycodone was coming in and out of these facilities, right? Well, let's look at an example. One of the doctors that I investigated there, she was this Total Medical Express location was out of Boca Raton, Florida. And, Boca Raton is a very affluent city. It's a very affluent community. But they had a lot. There was a lot of pain clinics there in Boca Raton, and this doctor was named Sherry Pinsley. And just to put it in perspective of how much oxycodone she was prescribing, because you wonder how they measure this stuff. Well, the DEA, when you order drugs, so say that Total Medical Express is ordering oxycodone, right? They're ordering it from a pharmaceutical company like Purdue or like Cardinal or like Kesson. These are some of these pharmaceutical companies that they would order the oxycodone from. Well, you have to fill out what's called a DEA 222 form, and you have to tell the DEA how much oxycodone you're ordering and who you're ordering it from. And the DEA keeps track of that, which is they keep track of it on what's called an ARCOS report. And an ARCOS report can show how much a dispensing practitioner or a pharmacy is ordering of oxycodone. So let's put this all in perspective. A pharmacy, your average pharmacy at this time, so I'm talking 2010, 2011, 2012, was ordering 65,000 units of oxycodone. So that's like your CVS, your Walgreens, your Rite Aids. This Dr. Sherry Pinsley ordered, and when I say 65,000 units, I mean that in a full year, 12-month period. And this Dr. Sherry Pinsley ordered 964,000 units of oxycodone in a year. She was the sixth highest orderer of oxycodone in the entire country. And, so I investigated her, and I investigated the whole clinic, and there was another doctor named Joseph Piazza, also who was in the top 10 of oxycodone prescribers in the country. And I want to say he was in the 500,000s. 5 or 600,000 off the top of my head. I can't look up those reports anymore. It's just something the DEA has, and they gave us to help us with our investigation. So they aren't public. But so I investigated these doctors, And yeah, I got their license taken away, and they went to jail. And the thing with Sherry Pinsley that's so baffling is she used to be an expert for the DEA. She was a DEA expert witness on pain medication. And, she talked to us when we interviewed her. She said that she was making probably about $430,000 a year when she owned her own private practice, and it was a legit private practice. But it was hard work, and it was a lot of hours, and it was stressful. And why do all that for $430,000 a year when you can just go to a pill mill and sign your life away and just stamp prescriptions and not even think, and make $500,000 a year? So, I mean, talk about the ultimate greed. This woman was having a lifestyle most of us can't even imagine. And it was just $70,000 more a year that enticed her to be a criminal, essentially. Um, it's just baffling to me. I still wonder how can someone do that? The amount of greed that it takes to make a decision like that is just unbelievable to me. And, she was probably about 64 years old, I think, when all this was happening. And she got sentenced to 12 years in prison. So that could be for the rest of her life in jail. And, there was just these two accountants that owned the pain clinics. And we eventually got them all shut down. I mean, I worked on most of the clinics myself and was the sole point person for this. And, they were the main competitor to this clinic called American Pain. And that American Pain was owned by two twin brothers named the George brothers. There was Jeff and Chris George. And they were the most successful pill mill organization in the country ever. They made $40 million total from these pill mills. I mean, it's serious money we're talking about here. And Total Medical Express was their biggest competitor. Did I investigate a doctor or two from American Pain? I did, but it was well after the fact that they were shut down and arrested. So I can't really speak much to them, but I can at least speak to Total Medical Express, which is who I worked against. And, it looks really bad on the surface, right? That you could it was a one-stop shop. You could go in and you can get your pills, and you could see a doctor and get your pills. You'd be in and out in a matter of 10 minutes total. I mean, sometimes we would time people, and they were dumb enough to have timestamps on their prescriptions that they kept in-house when they dispensed. So one doctor in particular, his name was John Christensen, and he was charged with murder. And he was linked to 50 different overdose deaths here in the state of Florida. He was the most lethal doctor that I know of. I don't think there's anyone that's beat him in that. And he probably could have got charged with more murder cases. But what's sad with these overdose death cases in pill mills is you need what's called a clean kill. That's what we call it, is a clean kill. And what's a clean kill? A clean kill is when a patient... So a patient dies from an oxycodone overdose, and John Christensen was the only provider that provided him oxycodone. Now, if they got oxycodone and doctor shot from several different clinics, you can't really determine who was the oxycodone dose that killed the patient, because say they're taking oxycodone from 4 different providers. I mean, how do you make that determination and prove that beyond a reasonable doubt? And it was easy to do that back then because there was no prescription monitoring system. So there was nothing that shows where patients were going to get their prescriptions. There was no central database that was being used. That's why Florida was such a hotbed for this at the time I was there. And that's why it was people from all over the country were coming to Florida. So that's kind of the backdrop of what was going on. And like I said, with John Christensen, he was here in West Palm Beach, and that's where my office was out of. was out of West Palm Beach, and he eventually did get charged with murder, and I think he was convicted of it. Um, but yeah, he was seeing a patient every 7 minutes. Every 7 minutes, he was writing a prescription to a patient for oxycodone. Imagine that. Imagine the proficiency, the assembly line, and how can you do a full exam on a patient in 7 minutes? Every 7 minutes. It's just unbelievable. And let me describe to you what these offices were like. These were in rundown strip malls where these pain clinics were set up. They weren't in some luxurious place. I mean, these were in rundown strip malls, and they had armed security guards there. Is that normal for a doctor's office when you have armed security guards and you have a waiting room full of 50, 60 patients that are all high on oxycodone? It was so bad that I saw this one doctor I investigated. His name was Rehat Fadarani, and he almost got killed actually because he wouldn't give one patient oxycodone, and the patient was so desperate he came back with a loaded gun and tried blowing his brains out, and the gun jammed, and luckily the doctor was able to wrestle it away from him. And based off of what he felt was a security threat to him, he actually got a detail from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, where a Palm Beach County sheriff stood outside his office in a vehicle protecting him while he prescribed drugs that were killing people. If that's not fucking disgusting, I don't know what is. So yeah, but when he was one person in particular I investigated and had a strong dislike for. And it was so bad that the patients were such addicts that went there that I would literally see them walk out of his practice, go into their car, and what they would do is they would put the oxycodone under tinfoil, and they would put a lighter under the tinfoil to liquefy the oxycodone and shoot it into their veins. And I'd watch them do it in the car right after I walked out of the facility. It was just unbelievable. I mean, this is the stuff you'd see, and you'd see 50, 60 patients in there that were all high and were all addicts. And, this was something that if you want to look at the demographics of who these people were that were going to get the oxycodone, was there people in there that were just going because they saw a money-making opportunity that, they could pay $5 a pill for oxycodone from the pain clinic, but they could charge $30 a pill on the street? Yeah, there was people who did that if they took those pills back to Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio, but majority of them were there because they wanted it for themselves. What they would do is they would come down to Florida for a week, and they hit up as many pain doctors as they could, so that way they'd have some pills for themselves and they'd have some pills to sell on the street. So it helped support their lifestyle and it helped fuel their addiction. That's what we saw. And I think it got ignored a little bit for a couple years, which was by Democratic Governor Charlie Crist, because it was helping with the economy that was so in dire straits because of the Great Recession. I mean, this was the tourism that was coming to Florida, which is disgusting when you think about it. So the demographics of these were poor white people. Overwhelming majority were white and poor, and from small towns in Ohio and Tennessee and Kentucky that were decimated. Maybe when I think about Kentucky, I think about the old coal mining towns that were abandoned, or jobs that were shipped overseas, the Rust Belt towns of Ohio, and they somehow got addicted to pain pills because they had an injury and they were just given 10 tablets of, let's say, oxycodone, 5 or 10 milligrams to take to hold over the pain, and they just loved the feeling, and that was their downward spiral. Um, it's just sad, and you would see lives destroyed from this. And I've been wrestling with this a lot, and trying to understand what I did, and I as much as I rail on things that are happening in our world and things like that, and what our true life's work is. And I'm actually proud of that work. I'm proud of taking these doctors off, putting them out, of a job, and sending a lot of them to jail. As a state investigator, let's be clear, I wasn't sworn. I wasn't in sworn law enforcement. I was there to regulate their doctor's license, but I worked hand in hand with law enforcement on getting rid of these people. And I would take their license while they would put them in jail. But I still think a lot about it. And that's why I'm doing this. I just need to talk about it. And I thought about reaching out to people and seeing if maybe I could get interviewed for it or something. But I just thought maybe it'd be better if I talked about it myself and just put it out on this for people to listen to. So yeah, I feel like what I did was right. But what I think about in the larger context, and probably what you're wondering is, well, why am I thinking about it so much then? Is what happened is Florida got a prescription drug monitoring system. So these people, we were able to monitor who was going where for drugs and if people were doctor shopping. So that took away a lot of people coming in from out of state. Not that they still didn't. They found savvy ways to get around it. A lot of them would get prescriptions from Florida, but they would go and fill those prescriptions somewhere else out of state. And I was still able to track those out because they were dumb enough to go to like a CVS or Walgreens. And I would just contact CVS or Walgreens and ask for what they call a patient profile and have them pull a national one, because they had systems where they could just query every CVS or Walgreens location across the country and see where that patient's getting prescriptions filled. So I was able to see that they somehow got a Florida ID, lied about that they lived in Florida, but they would go back to Massachusetts and fill these prescriptions. But what happened was they would move. So really, when it was a one-stop shop and you'd have all these pills in the pill mills that patients could get right after they saw the doctor, it was tremendously easy for us to investigate because they didn't want them going to a pharmacy. They wanted them to get filled there. And a lot of them would say, if you don't fill your prescription here, you're not being seen here. They wanted to maximize profit. I mean, this was greed. This was out of sheer greed. They knew these drugs were killing people and they didn't care. And there's evidence of that. If you ever read, there's a book called American Pain about the American Pain Clinic with the Jeff and Chris George, the twin brothers. If you ever read that book or just Google them and look up Florida articles, these people, these guys knew clearly that they were killing people and did not care at all. So this is just sheer greed. But what happened is once the drug monitoring system came into place, and then after the drug monitoring system, they wouldn't allow pain clinics to dispense drugs in the facility. So patients were forced to go to different pharmacies. So it was a lot harder, it was a lot more tedious to track where these patients were going to get the prescriptions filled, because what I have to do is, you have to think about Florida law, right? Is in Florida law, as a medical investigator, I'm HIPAA exempt. Anyone could share any patient information with me at any time, no questions asked. They're not violating HIPAA. They're not violating patient confidentiality. That's basically what HIPAA is, in case you don't know. So, it was easy for people to share things with me, but at the same time, the way the laws are in Florida is, in order for me to get a patient's record from a facility, the patient has to sign a patient release. Well, why would a pain patient sign a release for me to go take away their source of oxycodone's license away. Not going to happen. Where there are avenues to get patient records without a patient release, but you'd have to show proof. You'd have to show proof that the patient was being seen by the doctors. I'd have to go to all the different pharmacies and get copies of all the different prescriptions for the patients and put them in this affidavit and say, look, this patient's being seen by this doctor from this time, and here's what they're being prescribed, and it seems inappropriate, and you should let me get the records without a release so I can determine if it is. And so that's how I would get it. But months would go by, right? Because you'd have to get the medical board to meet about it and say, yeah, he can go get those records. And these weren't every month. These were maybe every other month. We'd talk about a month or two go by before they'd come down and say, yeah, go get those patient records. And lives are at stake here when this is happening. Like, let's not forget that. So it was a lot harder, actually, for us. It made our lives harder. But here's what I wanted to talk about is where we're not getting to the root of this, where I did feel like I was doing rightful work and getting rid of these doctors. But the source of this is the wholesalers, the people who actually make the oxycodone, to sell it to pharmacies or to the pain clinics when they were able to dispense the drugs. But now we're talking about pharmacies. And the wholesalers can keep track of how many drugs they're selling. The DEA keeps track of how many drugs they're selling. And the DEA keeps track of how much oxycodone is being ordered by the pharmacies. So this is towards the end for me, is the DEA what they would do is, you have to think about Matt Taibbi's Divide, where in that book Divide, he talks about two different Americas where, there's a different set of rules for the rich who do financial crimes compared to the poor who get caught with marijuana on them. That's the premise of his book, is to show you the different types of Americas, the two different Americas for these segments of society. And the same thing happened in the pharmaceutical industry. The mom and pop wholesalers that were selling the drugs and were selling a lot of oxycodone would get ripped off from the DEA. They'd get their DEA registration taken away, because you have to have a registration with the DEA to sell oxycodone, which is a controlled substance, and the DEA regulates controlled substances. And this is just in case you didn't understand that. So you'd have to have these things, and the DEA would rip off these mom and pop places, no problem, right? They would take them away. They'd even, and even the mom and pop pharmacies, these were easy people to go after. They didn't have the kind of funds to have adequate defense to fight the charges like the DEA brought about them. So they'd either get their license taken away, no problem, or, they could go to jail. I don't know if really a lot of them went to jail, to be honest, the pharmacies, the mom and pop ones. It was a lot easier for them to take their DEA registration away. But so what we started seeing is that the insane amount of orders of oxycodone wasn't just a mom and pop pharmacy thing, because what happens with the mom and pop pharmacies, you have to think about capitalism with this, is that the mom and pop pharmacies have to charge more money for all their pills because they're not ordering in the bulk that a Walgreens and CVS is. I mean, these wholesalers like Purdue and Kesson and Cardinal are going to cut Walgreens and CVS and Rite Aid a break because it's stores all over the country that are ordering volumes of pills for them. So they're going to give them a deal. But if you're a mom and pop pharmacy and you have one location, you're not getting the deal they are. You're going to have to pay more money. So what does that mean if I'm a mom and pop pharmacy? That means I got to sell my prescriptions for more money to actually make a profit. That CVS and Walgreens can undercut how much I sell these prescriptions for and put me out of business. So I'm already behind the eight ball because I'm a small business. So they knew that in order to make profit, they had to get into the oxycodone game. And that maybe they had to do things that they didn't think or that they didn't think the corporate pharmacies were doing, which was order a lot of oxycodone and be willing to sell it to anybody. Anyone that came in with a prescription, no questions asked, it would be filled. And you have to look at the Florida law to see why this is a problem too. All pharmacists are supposed to do, and that could be a pharmacy tech, doesn't even have to be the pharmacist, is verify the prescription with anyone in the doctor's office. The secretary can verify that that patient came in and was seen by the doctor. You don't have to get the doctor himself on the phone. That's how bad it is. So it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter who verifies. As long as someone verifies it, I write on the prescription, it was verified by Sarah, the receptionist, you're good. You are in compliance. So that's what was happening with these mom and pops to stay afloat as they were getting into the game, and the DEA was picking them off one by one. But we soon found out that the corporate pharmacies were also involved. And CVS and Walgreens got involved. There was a CVS in Sanford, Florida, which is around Orlando, and I believe it's where actually where Trayvon Martin lived. I'm pretty sure I'm correct on that. That ordered 1 million units of oxycodone in a year. Remember, I told you the average pharmacy ordered 65,000 units. So 1 million. They ordered 1 million, and they got their DEA registration suspended. And I think it got taken away. But towards my very end of being with the Department of Health as an investigator, we went and did an operation against Walgreens. Right? Walgreens, the friendly neighborhood pharmacy, because they gave us ARCOS reports. And what do those ARCOS reports show? They showed that about 30 to 40% of the top 100 ordering pharmacies in the state of Florida were from Walgreens and CVS. And these places were ordering 700,000 units of oxycodone, 500,000 units, mind-boggling numbers. So of course there's profit in it for them, right? But it's much more than that. And you have to understand that. And what's in it for them also is you've got to think about the employees. So let me back up and say we went on this operation. We visited all these Walgreens all over the state. We took their prescriptions, we scared them. And that was really us helping the DEA. This was the DEA's operation, let's be clear. And the DEA scared them. And then the next thing you know, the DEA has a meeting with their attorneys. It's the DEA's attorneys and it's Walgreens' attorneys. And they get down to business and they have this conversation of why this was happening. And so what happens? A couple Walgreens get their DEA registrations taken away and they get an $80 million fine. That's it. No one went to jail when 7 people a day were dying of overdose. And they're feeding this problem here that's in Florida. And so what you'll see in the press releases, and you'll see this, and I found an article about it in the USA Today, is they'll say that they found out it was a systemic business practice that was causing it. They won't tell you what that business practice is. And this is what's been on my mind that, 38 minutes ago when I started this recording, I wanted to tell you all about. What is that systemic business practice that was causing them to do this? You have to think about capitalism. And this is why capitalism is so evil. The systemic business practice was them giving their stores a quota of prescriptions to fill. And if they filled X amount of prescriptions in a day, the staff got a bonus. So let's say that you got 50, if you hit over 100 prescriptions a day, you filled over 100 that day, you get a bonus. So there was motive for profit. And you have to understand that, yes, pharmacists make really good money. They make 6 figures. But it's the techs The techs are the ones who are at the front lines, that are the ones getting the prescription presented to them, filling the bottle, putting the labels on it, and then giving it to the pharmacist. The pharmacist looks at the label, looks at the prescription, counts the pills, and you're on your way. And why were the techs so motivated? Because the techs make shit money. The techs make about 30 grand a year. So they needed the money. So you see a bunch of people that walk in looking like zombies because they're high from oxycodone. What do? You fill the prescriptions because you need the money, because you're struggling. And that's where I've been thinking about this for so long, is because I felt like now when I look at it, I was chasing my tail, really. Going running around in circles like you see a dog chasing their own tail. That was me. We know what the problem was. The problem was the wholesalers, the expensive, large corporate wholesalers that were making billions of dollars in profit, that they would, so now we have Purdue that people are suing, but no one's going to jail over this. And the FDA is allowing Purdue to now come out with a pill that is supposed to deal with opioid addiction, yet they caused the addiction. That company isn't getting dissolved. That's wrong. That's what I've been thinking about so much. And it's fucked up. I don't know what else to say about it, except that it's not, I wasn't getting to the root, right? And I didn't realize it at the time. And it took me to get away from that job and to start doing some reading about political analysis about getting to the root. And the root is they're the problem. So if anyone's listening to this and you want to figure out how to get to the root, to protest against the opioid crisis and to look at who's at blame, go right to the DEA's door. The DEA is the one who's responsible for giving out all the DEA registrations that allow people to work with controlled substances, like the pharmacies, like the wholesalers. All the DEA has to do is get rid of Purdue Pharma's DEA registration, and they're done. They can't do it anymore. So that's what we need to be protesting when we're looking at the opioid crisis. And we're not doing that. And that's why I wanted to talk about this today, because I want people to understand that this is what we need to do moving forward to address the opioid crisis. And I know the state of Oregon is thinking of taking a drastic step, as some people would say, is that they're thinking of getting rid of opioids altogether. And people are saying that people need these type of pills, that they're in serious pain. And there are people in serious pain. I am fortunately not one of those people, so I don't know what that feels like. So if you're listening to this and you know what it feels like, keep in mind that I don't know what it feels like. So I'm just trying to think this through. Is this a good idea or not? I think it is a good idea. Because while people are in serious pain, our people are dying from these pills. So we need to find another way to attack that pain and to help people manage that pain. And we need to deal with how we're treating addiction, because we're not treating addiction the correct way. I think we're having such a problem with it by saying it's a disease and it's hereditary and it's in your blood. And, I think it's bullshit. I'm sorry. I think people are addicted because they have trauma in their lives and they don't know how to deal with that trauma. And so they turn to other things to deal with that trauma. When you watch these shows, when you watch this A&E show Intervention, what is the common theme with everyone's story that's addicted is that they've had some trauma in their life. Something bad's happened to them. They were sexually molested as a child. They were abandoned. Look at all the homeless vets that go to war, all the trauma they experience. I can't even imagine what that's like to try to deal with. They have to turn to something else to try and get through the day. We're not dealing with the trauma properly, I don't think. I think that's the problem. And also lack of resources in healthcare, let's be honest. This is a for-profit industry. It's not being looked at as a human right. Maybe if we had these things looked at as a human right mindset, it would be treated better, which it's not. My friend Luke, who was on one of the shows a couple shows ago, we've been talking about this, about trauma and about resources that people need that they're not given. So I think these are things we need to think about, and I think we're not. Do have a crazy story that I wanted to tell too, and people always ask, well, what's your craziest story? So I'll tell you this story. This really has nothing to do with politics. It's just kind of a crazy story. Is there was a woman. So right when you had a pain clinic in Florida, you'd have to have a license for that pain clinic to operate that pain clinic, and that license we would regulate. So which is why we were able to shut down pain clinics, because we would say they were violating laws that regulated their license. Well, we found this woman who was operating a pain clinic out of her house, and she didn't have a license. But we could tell she was operating a pain clinic because everything we pulled from her, which is great with the drug monitoring system, we were able to see that everything she was prescribing was opioids. And in order to be considered a pain clinic, you have to prescribe more than 50% of all your prescriptions have to be opioid. More than 50% of the patients you treat have to be for pain. And this was obvious from all the prescriptions we found. So, we do this investigation, and we're with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. And we go in and we do a search warrant at her house, right? So we go in and do the search warrant. We find out she's a hoarder. This is a doctor. This is a medical doctor. She's a hoarder. You can barely walk into her house. It's full of stuff. She doesn't even sleep on her bed because her bed's full of just random items. That's how bad it is. So we open her fridge, right? And there's frozen, she took patients' urine and froze it in the fridge. So we see all this frozen urine in there. We see medications dated from the 80s and 90s that she's administering to patients. Completely expired, totally dangerous. But outside in her lanai where her pool is, it's pristine, immaculate. But the rest of her house is a mess. She's writing patient records on the back of envelopes for mail on random folders, trying to keep track of who the patients are and what she gave them. So the police, the sheriff's office sits her down in the pool because that's like the only really clean place for them to put her while we're looking through the house. So I'm in the kitchen, and there's this circular dining room table, and we go and walk by the table, and someone accidentally knocks a plastic bin over, and it goes onto the ground, and you hear this crash, and we're looking, and these bones come out. And you hear the doctor in the lanai, which is backing up to the kitchen, go, "What's that noise? What is that?" And somebody says, "Well, there's this plastic container that we accidentally knocked over with bones. Like, what are these for?" So she says to us that, "Oh, it's a cat that I found that I've been meaning to put back together." I mean, obviously this woman had some psychological issues that were not being dealt with. Hence the hoarding, hence just her mind frame when we were with her. So that's my crazy story. People ask, I thought I'd tell it here. And let me be clear, too. There's something I definitely want to say about this DEA operation that I went on, is that all of the people in the DEA I were with wanted to see Walgreens go away. They wanted every single place shut down. But the people that were the foot soldiers on the ground, it wasn't their say. These were people that were way above their pay grade who made the decisions they made. So when you see some of these front-level employees, they may think the way we think about this, that they should have been abolished. They had no say in it. That's what I saw. And that's all I can say about it is these are the things I saw. I just can only speak to what I've seen and what I observed and what that all means. And, this is dangerous stuff. You're dealing with people's livelihoods and money. I mean, one of the doctors that was for Total Medical Express, he was the biggest prescriber. He went to the most locations. His name was Dr. Quinn Carter, who was an osteopathic physician. and he knew I was investigating him, and he left a note for me in the stairwell of my office, basically just threatening me because I was doing this. So, and here I am, a state investigator making $32,000 a year at the time, barely getting by, living in Florida with no family or friends. And the only reason I was able to live in Florida and not move back to Chicago and live with my parents because my parents were helping support me. And these are the things I'm dealing with. Those are another things that make you think, you're putting yourself at risk when you do things like this. And this is the kind of life they expect you to live and be provided with. I don't know, it's just unbelievable to me. And it's been about 50 minutes since I've started on this, and there was other things I wanted to say. Usually I have notes here, and I don't remember some of the other stuff I wanted to get into with this opioid crisis, but I hope you all learn a little bit more about me with it, learn more about the opioid crisis that's going on, and think about it. Think about some of the things that I talked about, and hopefully you can educate some people on. It's a complicated issue, but it calls for radical action, like everything else in our world right now, to deal with. And that's why I wanted to talk about it. So thank you all for listening to this. And that's the rant. That's all the time I'm going to put into this rant. And this is the end of the episode of Moving Forward on the Progressive Radio Network. You can find this episode and all episodes in the PRN archives at Podbean. Now they're putting them out on YouTube. Or you can find them on my website, which is robmovesforward.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening to Moving Forward on the Progressive Radio Network.